you probably recognize I like talking, and I like being in front of audiences. Strange combination with someone who also likes statistics, right? Well, each to their own. So, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about some other aspects of my journey over the years that I've been enjoying being a statistician. We're going to talk about social sciences research in general, not too long about the past, but a little bit, just to help you obtain a little bit better understanding of what the foundation is of where we are today. By the way, I'm in marketing, you know, and I do write books, and I'm a salesman, and I'd love to have you buy my books. So by the way, the book that I talked about, this is the cover up here of the latest edition, Multivariate Data Analysis, 8th edition. I started writing it, as I shared with you earlier, right after I got out of school. I almost didn't get it published, which would have been, for my career, made it much more challenging. My first job was at a small university, and no one in that university had ever published a book. And yet, as naive as I said, I'm going to publish a book. And of course, my book was on statistics, as the title reflects, and it was a different book though. And it was a combination of my marketing, recognizing the opportunity and the knowledge and stats that I had acquired. So philosophically, you must have, in a marketing situation, you must have what's called a value proposition. The value proposition is your perception of what the audience for your product, or the market for your product, is interested in. And the fact that I didn't know statistics gave me that perspective so that I could understand what the value proposition was and hopefully deliver it. In spite of the fact that I didn't know anything about it. Okay? But the value proposition, as I sort of briefly shared with you earlier, was I wanted to write something in plain English. I wanted to eliminate the formulas. And truthfully, for the first 3 editions of the book, there was only one formula in it. And the formula in it was, how do you combine multiple variables into a single variable, or certainly many variables into a smaller number of variables, and at the same time have something meaningful for understanding the data. And I wanted to communicate it so that the audience could read it without understanding the formulas. And so we did write it. And actually, a little story about writing the book. The first 3 editions had content in it like, what is factor analysis? What is multiple regression? What is discriminant analysis? And how do you run the software? When we finished writing it, it was only about 200 pages. And we started contacting publishers, and we said, well, we have this great new book, and we want you to publish it. And the publisher said, well, it's not long enough. It's a stats book. All the other stats books are about 400 pages long. So we're not interested in it at 200 pages. Well, what did we do? We had already written everything we knew about it up to that point. What else do you add? We don't have any more than 200 pages. So in those days, we didn't have access to electronic databases like you have. All of the articles were either in journals, or if they weren't in journals, they put them in what was called readings books. And you pick the best articles and you put them together in the book. So what we did, since we wanted to get it published, is we said, we're going to have multivariate data analysis with readings. So for the first 3 editions, got creative again as marketers. And at the end of each of the chapters, we had 2 to 3 of the best journal articles that provided additional examples of the techniques that we included. But that wasn't the only thing where we had to become creative. We went to the publishers, and of course, we were so proud of having written that book that we wanted to tell our market what our value proposition was. And we expressed it in 1 sentence, if you can believe it, because we thought that was really the essence of the value proposition. That 1 sentence stated something like the following: just as you do not need to be an automobile mechanic to drive an automobile, you don't need to be a statistician to use multivariate data analysis. Very logical, right? That's what we wanted people to know, because we had identified with our marketing expertise that the market was huge. If you could just teach people how to use the software, how to select the techniques, and how to interpret the data when it came out. Well, I think we can all agree the multivariate data analysis is a statistics book. Okay? Well, publishers, like most companies, collect market data, or at least they collect some information to be able to decide if they should publish the book. It's an economic proposition like many other business decisions. Well, as naive as we were, we didn't think about the fact that if you have a statistics book, who are they going to call on to evaluate the book and tell them if in fact the book should be published? A statistics book? They call on statisticians. And of course, these statisticians read the preface, which is where the statement was, and they flipped through the book, and they said, this is a crummy book. It doesn't have any formulas in it. Okay? So, publisher comes back, the first one, the second one, the third one, and said, oh, there's no formulas in this book. It doesn't have a market. But yes, it does. You're missing what the true market is. Well, at that point in my career, I certainly didn't have any books. This is the first one. I hadn't published any journal articles. Nobody in the university that I was working with in the College of Business had ever published a book or a journal article. We had no credibility. Oh, you know, again, I keep reflecting on my marketing ability. And so what we decided to do is to rely on that marketing ability. And the 4th publisher we went to, instead of sitting down in a room and talking about it a little bit, we said, let's go out to dinner tonight. So I took the editor out to dinner along with my co-authors. We all did. We bought him a nice meal, a number of alcoholic beverages, and towards the end of the evening we said, after all we've told you, you know this is a good book. You know that you should publish it. Yeah, well, okay. And he agreed. Next morning at breakfast, I saw him again. I said, you remember what you said last night? You told me you were going to publish my book. You are going to do it, right? And he said, I guess so. Sometimes the old tried and true methods of marketing and sales work magic in terms of achieving your goal. Anyway, the first edition sold about 3,500 copies. Okay, not bad. In the US, though, they want bigger ones, but the biggest thing that made that book a successful, other than me and my co-authors, the biggest thing really was our small publisher that was the initial one that agreed to publish it decided to sell the list of titles that they had in the business area to a company called Macmillan. Macmillan, a larger publisher, and then later on, Macmillan decided to sell their list of business titles to Pearson. I bet you all heard of Pearson, the largest publisher in the world. Automatically, from the third edition, when they picked it up, when it was selling 10,000 copies, automatically we had worldwide distribution, and the next edition, it sold 50,000. In the last almost 45 years that the book's been out, we're pushing about 600,000 copies of that book. Small niche market, but a huge market share. It's changed my life. Everybody knows me, all right, and I introduce myself occasionally as the hair in Hair It All. Because when I'll go around and I'll introduce myself and say, "Hi, I'm Joe here," and they'll say, "Okay." And they stand around and they look and I say, "Yes, I'm the hair in Hair It All." And then all of a sudden, things change a little bit. So I want to talk to you about that journey because it's been a superb journey. My two other books in related areas are in a technique that is fairly recent to emerge. Partially square structural equation marketing and structural equation modeling. A similar situation occurred with that in terms of recognizing an opportunity. I was at a conference, and I encourage you to go to conferences so that you can network and meet people and create opportunities for yourself and find co-authors. So in 2010, I was at the Academy of Marketing Science, and I ran into a young fellow by the name of Marco Sarstedt, who didn't even have his degree then, and we got talking. He was new to the organization, and I said, "Tell me about your doctoral research." And he too was one of the ones that I introduced myself, and he kind of said, "Oh, I don't know who you are." But he had written his dissertation on partial least squares, and so I said, "I'd like to learn something about that method." The previous edition of the multivariate book had only 3.5 pages on partial least squares. That's the 2010 edition. And the publisher at that point was not ready to publish another edition. So I said, someone needs to write a book about partial least squares. And so I said immediately to him, I said, "You know a lot about partial least squares. I don't know very much, but you, along with me, we can write a book." He doesn't have a degree, and he's standing next to Joe Hager. And I said, "Let's write a book." And so since then, we recognized that opportunity, and there was nothing there. And so we wrote the primer, and the primer's now in its second edition. We're soon to write the third edition. But it's captured a market for a really useful, easy to use, if you can think of any major statistics technique as being easy to use method that is really extending our capabilities tremendously in terms of dealing with the huge amounts of data out there. It is the foundational technique used in data mining and data analytics, and it is combined with some other techniques that execute different kinds of analyses. But the American Customer Satisfaction Index, the European Customer Satisfaction Index, all of those major predictions or assessments of customer satisfaction with companies are executed by partial least squares structural equation modeling. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, but I want to go back to my journey back to the social sciences. Statistics, as we know them even today, was developed in the 1900s. They came up with formulas. They developed something called correlation. They developed something called regression. They developed something called multiple regression and discriminant analysis and other kinds of techniques. So in the early 1900s, even before me, they were developing these foundational techniques. We used those foundational techniques and they helped us a lot in social sciences research for many years. In fact, it wasn't until the 1980s when we had the tool, which is the most pervasive tool today in social sciences research, which includes the business discipline. In fact, some colleagues, former students of mine who now are successful as well, have done a content analysis of the major journals in business. We completed that about 6 or 7 years ago. And from that content analysis, we determined that almost 50% of all the articles that are published in empirical-based research use some form of structural equation modeling. So that's why we have determined that at least in terms of social sciences research, if about 50% of the articles use that method, then in fact it must be a foundation of a lot of research that's being conducted out there. So it wasn't until the 1980s when we began applying it, however, in research in the social sciences and in business. Why do you think 1980 was a big year? Well, it's a round number, but it's not really the number of the year. What happened in 1979 was that was the year for the first software that executed structural equation modeling. Okay, before that it was all done by hand. Okay, and even with the new software, it was what I would call clunky. Clunky means in English, it didn't work very well. And it was also slow. What you do today in 2 to 3 seconds, you could do, or it required in those days, days, literally days to get a solution, if in fact you got that solution at all. So you have a lot of things that benefit you and make you more efficient and effective as researchers and as data scientists today. In 1980, they introduced or they developed the structural equation modeling and started writing the software, but the software that was written was only for one of the 2 major types of structural equation modeling. It's called covariance-based sim. And it took from the 1980s to 10 years later to reach the point where we didn't have to be able to write Fortran. We had to write Fortran and computer languages to get the solution. Fortunately, by the 90s, we had point and click. We got later on drag and drop. And that helped us to advance dramatically the kinds of research problems and analysis that we could use. We got additional developments in measurement because one of the things we wanted to do is overcome the old saying of garbage in, garbage out. Wanted to be able to improve the measurement so that we could effectively assess reliability and validity. And of course, about that time, we started the data explosion. The data explosion, the techniques, and all led us to where we are today with big data and data analytics. We invented a word, demystification, getting rid of the mystery in statistics. So today, for better or for worse, we're in a situation where if you can determine the data that goes in, if you can select the proper technique, if you can look at the numbers and identify what we call the red flags, which suggests the possibility of a problem in the analysis, if you know the assumptions, how to apply those assumptions, and ultimately to interpret it and make it meaningful, you can run software you can run multivariate data analysis, including some of the latest structural equation modeling development. So for you, we expect much bigger and better things in the future, because you can take these mountains of data that are increasingly available and solve problems that could never be solved before. Let's talk about what structural equation modeling was, because some of you probably have not applied structural equation modeling. I see some of you are students. My students are always scared when they start out in the course and say, structural what? Modeling what? And then, you know, I get beyond the words a little bit, but they're still scared. So let's talk about what the value is. Most of you have probably executed what we call multiple regression. Multiple regression has been around for more than 100 years. And multiple regression enables us to do what we call prediction. Prediction is important because it helps us not only to examine the patterns to data today, but to be able to predict the future. And of course, success in the future is about predicting what's going to happen, or identifying opportunities that will emerge before other people do. Multiple regression is capable, though, of only predicting a single number or a single variable, which limits it tremendously. It's only capable of handling several variables that will predict it, because the baseline is the best prediction of a single number is the average. But the average is not very helpful in terms of the accuracy of prediction. We need to use other pieces of information, other variables that help us to say, if we have X, that will produce Y. So multiple regression, though, has a number of limitations. I've got a diagram up here of the structural equation modeling. So, for example, if we measured purchase likelihood, let's say of a mobile phone, and we had questions that we asked people about, what do you think about Apple iPhones or iPads or iWatches or some kind of Samsung, Huawei, whatever. If we ask them questions about how do you feel about various mobile phones, then that can help us to understand a little bit about the likelihood that they would purchase our phone, correct? What would help us to do that even better? Well, what if we knew what their experience was? What if we knew who and where they were searching for information? If we're using regression, we can only have one variable, one piece of information about purchase likelihood. We can only have one piece of information about brand attitudes. There are lots of other things about brand attitudes in addition to, for example, do you trust the brand? Are you passionate about the brand? Those are important issues, but if you can only ask one of those questions, that will limit your ability to predict. Let's look at information search. If you're thinking about the next mobile phone that you're going to buy, who do you talk to? Well, maybe you don't talk to anybody. Maybe you go to the internet. You do a web search. All right, well, where do you search? Well, you're probably going to search several different companies. You may search the blogs. You may search other websites where people who have had experiences with the same phone in the past, or maybe with multiple phones. You may eventually talk to your friends, and you may say, what kind of phone do you have? What are your experiences? How much did it cost? How old is it? Did the screen crack? Does it continue to work well? How fast is it? All pieces of information that are important. The problem if you are using multiple regression is you can only have one question about your information search instead of maybe 20. You can only have one question about brand attitudes when there might be 10 or 15. So regression, while it was a very useful technique to us for a while, it's no longer as effective as is structural equation modeling. Structural equation modeling enables us to have many questions about brand attitudes, many questions about information search, and all of the green ovals on that diagram. But we're not limited to just those. We can literally have hundreds of variables. A colleague of mine ran a simulation because he wanted to test structural equation modeling and its ability to handle multiple variables. His simulation with multiple variables included 250 million variables, and it still gave him a solution. Pretty impressive. So the techniques of structural equation modeling will enable us to predict things that we never could predict before, and increasingly we have even more capabilities. So we're able to predict things that we would like to in business and in life that we never could predict before. And structural equation modeling is a fundamental message that we can, with a fundamental technique that we can use to obtain that. Structural equation modeling also could not have multiple phases as we see in this model, with phase one maybe being purchase likelihood, phase two being brand attitudes and information search, and then additional variables that we back up. So structural equation modeling is an excellent and very useful technique that you should be learning about. And with the capabilities of software like Smart PLS, it's very, very easy to obtain. In addition to being able to examine multiple variables, however, it can also enable you to relatively easily assess the quality of your data. Is it reliable? Is it valid? Is it measuring what you think it's measuring? And it's not just a qualitative observation or assessment. It is a quantitative method of evaluating reliability and validity, which are ultimately indicators of the accuracy of your data. So simultaneously, you have a single technique that is capable of analyzing many variables at the same time and, to the extent possible, improving the accuracy of our predictions. Well, I think we have a number of professors in here, and we probably have some students here, master students, but some of you, I'm sure, have published. I know you have because you're AACSB accredited, and that's a requirement. So even if you're not a professor, you might be thinking about publishing in social sciences journal. So I've often been asked questions about, should I be using structural equation modeling in my analysis? Should I use it in my empirical studies? Well, the project that I undertook with my colleagues looked at that, and how did we examine it? How did we get the data? One of my co-authors was an associate editor with the Journal of Business Research, one of the better business research journals being published. And as associate editor, he had access to all the journals, all the articles that were processed. And they processed a lot of articles. The Journal of Business Research processes about 6,000 papers a year. When I say process, it means people look at it, they say, what's the quality of it? Does it make a contribution? So anyway, he had access to those. We conducted a random sample of a period of 6 months, and we used that data and looked at all the articles in that 6 months period that were in fact reviewed. Now for those of you who don't know about publishing, the review process kind of goes like this, and I'll summarize it quickly. Basically, the 6,000 or so articles from the Journal of Business Research come in and a panel of people look at them, and very often as high as 50% of those articles are rejected. Okay, so they're what we call desk rejected. To process 6,000 articles a year and have at least 2 reviewers, that's 12,000 reviewers. And by the way, if it gets to the second review, that's another article. The bottom line, a lot of articles are desk rejected. Why do they get rejected? Well, sometimes the authors do not do enough research to make sure that the journal they submit their article to actually has an audience that would be interested in the topic. So that's one of the things you need to do, is to make sure that in fact, when you submit a paper, that in fact the journal has an audience that would be interested in your topic. Above and beyond that, there are a number of other issues like the data analysis and the survey method and things like that. But in our article here, we identified all the articles that pass what we call the desk reject. And those articles actually went out to reviews, and they got reviews. And the major things they review those on are, is the topic relevant? What about the research methods, the quality, the data analysis, the conceptualization, the writing quality, and whatever? And you see some numbers. And we divided them into categories of the articles that use structural equation modeling and the ones that didn't. And we've got mean values or mean scores as we've identified up there. And if you see in the middle, we've got 4 of those that are red numbers. Now, the articles under the SIM column are all as means higher than the articles under no SIM. But the ones in red in the middle are statistically significantly higher. What's the interpretation? The interpretation is, a simple interpretation anyway, is if you apply structural equation modeling in your research, the likelihood of a favorable review and ultimate publication is statistically significantly higher. Above and beyond that though, I really don't want to tell you that that's as simple as that. Because when you apply the technique, you have to know how to apply it and apply it properly. But in order to obtain a solution, it requires much more investment in terms of the design of your research and the care that you take. And the process itself improves the measurement and the accuracy of the predictions. So when we look at it above and beyond that, using structural equation modeling is helpful, but the knowledge of when and how to use it is equally as important. I talk to a lot of groups outside the U.S., and I'll be honest with you, I hear a lot of complaints about U.S. authors have advantages over non-U.S. And so I decided, along with my co-authors, to look and drill down a little bit more. So what we did is we decided to divide the data into articles with U.S. authors and those with non-U.S. authors. First thing I'm going to tell you about, though, is this is a crude measure. Because you have problems in here with this data. How do you identify a U.S. author? I mean, we have U.S. authors who are outside the U.S. at universities, good universities like yours. We also have faculty members who are from your universities who are teaching at U.S. universities. So, as I said, a crude measure. What we did is we identified and we defined U.S. authors are papers that have at least one author who is at a U.S. affiliated university. Okay, because the reason we justified is that that author would likely have been knowledgeable about some of the things that are required to apply structural equation modeling and would have had the ability to apply those and improve the quality. If you look at the measure, what you will see is it's pretty consistent with the other. Basically, the papers based on an overall quality rating, the papers that applied SEM in general are higher quality than the papers that do not apply it. And then secondly, it is true if you have a U.S. author that the likelihood of getting a higher rating with a structural model is greater. I always talk to people about in publishing and in success, I always tell them, get a good co-author. Find someone, whether they're U.S. or not, that has good methodology skills. That will help you at least increase the likelihood of a favorable review in your publishing efforts. So, let's talk about publishing a little bit more. I've already mentioned the idea of thinking about identifying people that would help you to improve your research. Identify someone who has strengths in publishing, whether it's methods or literature review or whatever, strengths that offset your limitations. I'll be the first one to tell you, I hate writing literature reviews. I mean, I can do that. I had to do it to do my doctoral research, but I don't like that. Okay, but I'm good at methods. So I always find someone who's going to take the lead on literature reviews, and I can do with that data things that many people can't do. I can do the drill down and find it. So I've learned that pairing myself with someone with strengths that I don't have is a good way to improve the likelihood that I could, in fact, be successful in publishing. When I wrote the primer that I mentioned earlier, the book that is now a very successful book, I told you I only had 3.5 pages in the former edition. I knew almost nothing about partial least squares. I know a lot about structural equation modeling. I knew almost nothing, though, about partial least squares, which is a very, very different approach from the covariance-based SEM. But I found authors, co-authors, Sarstadt and Ringel, Christian Ringel, the developer of Smart PLS, and what they did is they wrote the first reviews, the first versions of the chapters, except for the introduction chapter, which I wrote it. Now, I'm going to tell you that was a real experience working with German co-authors. Because you may not know this, but culturally speaking, Germans feel like if it's difficult to read and looks complex, that impresses people that you're intelligent and smart. That's the opposite of what I think. I think you should focus on the market and what the market wants, and I have learned over many years that the market wants simple, not complex. We struggled for almost a year because I would get things that were summarizing the techniques, but they had all these formulas. I kept saying, take the formulas out, or how do we minimize them? But eventually, my book knowledge and my knowledge of marketing, in fact, produced a very successful book because, again, my experience with other techniques taught me that it was that way. I tell you, every time I see those guys, they thank me and say, wow, we really appreciate you helping us to learn that the market really wants something that's readable and understandable, because they too, when they're going around, have people come up to them and say, wow, we really like your book. They never had people coming up to them before when they were writing articles with formulas and complex issues. So find someone that can help you to understand the market and how to write an article that enables you to communicate effectively a story. Writing a journal article is like writing a story. You have to catch people's attention early on, otherwise they're not going to read the entire article. You also should think about submitting to special issues. I've co-edited, I guess, 15 or 20 special issues. My colleagues have done the same thing over the years, and a little known secret is the reviews are often not as rigorous in special issues as they are in your regular journal articles. It's also easier with special issues very often to access the co-editors or the editors of those special issues who will work with you to overcome some of your shortcomings. By the way, people think my articles never get rejected. That's not true. I get rejections just like everybody else. Probably fewer than you. Well, you know, we learn a little bit over the years. But the truth is, my articles can always, almost always anyway, can always be improved by input from other people. When you get a revise and resubmit, which is exactly what you should hope for, because a revise and resubmit is your first opportunity to really defend your work. When you submit it, it goes out for review, and they look at it and they evaluate it, but you don't get to defend it. So truthfully, getting to the second stage is really what you want. Everything that you get back in that review, by the way, is not necessarily correct. Reviewers make mistakes. Not a lot, but they do make mistakes. And you also should not be concerned about saying, I disagree with the reviewer. But if you say that, you don't just say, I disagree. You say, I disagree because. And you always say, thank you for telling me about that. Even though you don't accept it at all. You just say, that person really doesn't understand what I was doing. And you say, thank you for telling me about that. And here's what I've done. So anyway, be respectful, respond to it. Don't be afraid, by the way, to contact the editor and say, I think I've had an unfavorable review, or I think somebody didn't see this when they read my article. Remember, editors are people, and in most instances, they're really nice people. Okay? And that's another reason for you to go to conferences. When you go to conferences, you can meet people, and you can meet editors. You can go to the editor sessions, and if you meet someone and you impress them, or even if you just say hello and please remember me, you know, when you email them, which is a typical way that you contact, they will remember you. And 9 out of 10 of them will be very, very nice. Every once in a while, there's a bad egg around. So get to know people. Don't be afraid to contact them. And they very often will help you. As I say here, the editor should be your friend. But you never give up. Everybody gets rejections. If it's not accepted, find another home. Find another home. There are lots of journals out there. Find another home. Be very careful, however, today, because we have the phenomenon called predatory journals. Predatory journals are in the business of making money, not publishing quality research. So do not submit to them. But never give up, because almost everything you write will probably find a home in a journal somewhere. All right, well, let's talk about what I refer to as second generation modeling, second generation analytics. Second generation statistical methods were in fact developed and became popular in the 80s, but because the first software was for covariance-based sim, which is in fact based on common variance and executed by the software initially called Literal, that you may have heard of, and then subsequently Amos, it became very prevalent. And in fact, truthfully, there are lots of people out there that do not even know that there are two types of structural equation modeling. They think only of visceral or whatever. But fortunately, the second generation goes beyond the initial emergence of covariance-based sim to incorporate more recently partial least squares. And if you notice here in terms of the trend in the application and the number of articles published with the use of partial least squares, the alternative type of structural equation modeling. If you look on the left-hand side, before 2000, there were never more than 10 articles a year published with partial least squares. If you start looking at 2005, that's when the first version of Smart PLS came out. And after the red era, you notice it goes up exponentially because Smart PLS was the first user-friendly software to execute partial least squares structural equation modeling. Now, one of the things you may not know is that structural equation modeling, and this is probably based on my comments, was developed in the early years just like a number of the other methods, but we didn't use it because it was so difficult to execute. So my co-authors and I were interested in what was the first article published in a scholarly journal using structural equation modeling. And so we searched the literature since we can today, and this is a picture of the first article that ever we could find, to the extent that Google was correct, and it's called Predicting the Birth Weight of Guinea Pigs. What do you people think about guinea pigs? Yeah. Woo. Guinea pigs, why would they search or why would they study guinea pigs? Well, this is lab research. It's in the farming sector because in 1921, those were the issues that were important to business. How could we improve farm production? And of course, it could be growing wheat or growing corn or peas or other kinds of vegetables, but it's also livestock. Well, if you're interested in improving the production of livestock, you're probably not going to have a lab where you can put cows. You're probably, if you did, it's much bigger and more expensive. So the scientists that we identified, Sewell Wright, who's the author of the first one, used guinea pigs because you could study them in the labs, and you could have a small lab. And as I said, here's the first example. By the way, today, those of you who use structural equation modeling know that in this case, the A, B, C, D, E are the independent variables, and the two dependent variables, X and Y, are on the left. Today, we have the independent variables on the left and the dependent variables on the right. Secondly, that is obviously hand-drawn, and we have software that makes it a lot easier and better to use today. So his research was about predicting the birth weight of guinea pigs. Why is that an important research question to the farming sector? What does birth rate have in terms of efficiency and effectiveness? The higher the birth rate, the greater the likelihood of survival. Okay, so you want to come up with a method of improving the likelihood of survival. The second thing is the length of time between birth and maturity when you can take your livestock to the market to sell. The time is shorter. Again, you don't have to feed it for as long. This was very crude in terms of production, but it was a seminal piece of research because what he studied in the lab was what you could feed, what you should feed, and how you should feed it, the timing, some fairly, for those days, good measures, but for today's measures would be very crude in terms of the production and what you should do to increase the birth rate. Let's go forward to today. And this same approach is being used in terms of production of pigs, horses, cows, whatever. But the scenario is very, very different. They have sensors hooked to the cows. These sensors are used to determine how they are digesting the food. They have sensors to measure the birth rate. They have done research to determine the proper temperatures. They have done research to find out the music that will mean higher birth rate. Everything is based on artificial intelligence and data, on all the things that they can use to be efficient. That's happening in the US, it's happening in Germany, it's happening in the UK, in Australia. That's why this is a seminal piece of research, because it was the first time that a researcher proved that you could in fact influence the birth rate of guinea pigs and therefore extend that knowledge to other livestock and improve your productivity using data. By the way, I don't know if you eat guinea pigs here. We don't eat them in the US either, but our Academy of Marketing Science group, that's all right. Our Academy of Marketing Science last year went down to Peru. And in Peru, guinea pigs are a delicacy. Yes, Peru, they're a delicacy. So if you've been involved, are we back yet? If you've been involved in planning a program, you know there's always a banquet. And you're always trying to determine the least expensive food to serve because you're on a budget. In the US, we always call it rubber chicken because it's chicken that's not very tasty and it's not very tender. But when we were looking at it in Peru, we found out that one of the least expensive options, and of course a delicacy, was guinea pigs. So we decided to serve that at our luncheon banquet. Did we tell everybody? Not until afterwards. And the people said, "We ate guinea pigs?" And yes. Did you like it? Well, it was okay. All right, well, what is the objective of covariance-based sound? How much more time do I have? I'm just going to go ahead. She'll tell me. All right. Well, when we got covariance-based sound, which started in 1980 because of the software, it was really a seminal piece of research and work like the guinea pig study. But the problem is that it had very rigorous assumptions. One of those assumptions is called normality of data. And if you get in a multiple variable situation, it's called multivariate normality. Strange words again. Okay, if you've done any social sciences research, you know that the data is never, ever normally distributed. Normal distribution means a bell-shaped curve. Right? It's almost always, with social sciences research, skewed to the left, skewed to the right. Covariance-based sim, as is true of a lot of the other statistics before partial least squares, required normal data. And of course, here's that funny word that I talked about earlier, homoscedasticity. Again, it's about consistency of the data. Uncorrelated errors, all those are requirements. And finally, large sample sizes. Okay, all of those are challenges if you are in fact trying to conduct empirical research and ultimately get it published. The reason that partially squares is increasing in popularity is because, number one, it is okay to use it with data that is not normally distributed. Check one. Number two, if you have skewed data, it's okay to use it with it. Check 2. Small sample sizes are okay. If you're doing consumer research, it's easy to get large sample sizes. You can interview lots of people. All right, but if you're doing business-to-business research, which is where I publish my research a lot, you're in trouble. Most of my research in applied business area was in sales and sales management. But still, it was business-to-business research. Let's say, for example, you want to find out how the chief information officer, or the chief financial officer, or the chief marketing officer of the top 100 listed companies in Indonesia, or Europe, or some other country, how they feel about a particular issue that's important in business. Your population is 100. How do you, in fact, get a sample size large enough to be able to apply a sophisticated technique? Well, the bottom line is you can't, because covariance-based structural equation modeling, the lowest estimate for those samples is 200 to 250. So you basically can't use the other method. In contrast, structural equation modeling, if you know how to apply it, can be successfully applied and get good solutions with very small sample sizes. I'm not advocating small sample sizes, but the flexibility of being able to conduct research where the population is small and it's impossible to get larger samples, the ability is there to learn about those situations and advance science in ways that were never possible before. Another very important advantage is that if you are going to be using unstructured data, which, as we talked about earlier, unstructured data, which represents 90% of all the new data that's being produced, that unstructured data is being coded, and it's being coded into data. It's being coded into data that is only usable with partial least squares. So most of the data, archival secondary data that's being produced today is in fact the kind of data that you need to use partial least squares structural equation modeling with because of the flexibility. Okay, let's move on beyond that because totally my time is up. I think I've changed, I talked about this a little bit, but I mentioned to you that it's changing the power structure in organizations. One of the things that I want to point out to you is that in the U.S. as of 2017, the information technology budget in corporations was in fact being spent mostly or controlled by line managers. As a proportion of the budget, it was always higher by chief information officers and the technology aspects. As of 2017, it transferred from the technology officers to the marketing and the financial officers. Now, if you're in marketing and finance, you think that's good. If you're the chief information officer who's in charge of designing and protecting the system, particularly the privacy of the data that you have, it scares you. Because now the focus of the money that's being spent is on executing business, increasing sales, managing profits, as opposed to protecting your data. So in fact, now the focus is more so on execution than on protection of the data. All right, well, let me finish up here quickly. I've talked about some a little bit, but there are lots of developments that are emerging and will be forthcoming in the area of structural equation modeling, particularly partial least squares. Hierarchical linear modeling, what we call unobserved heterogeneity. Let me briefly tell you what that means. Observed heterogeneity are observed differences were traditionally thought of, well, let's compare males and females. Let's compare large companies and small companies. Let's identify something that, based on our current knowledge, we believe might result in some differences in our findings. That's observed heterogeneity based on our current knowledge. Unobserved heterogeneity is a method that you can apply to structural equation modeling, and it identifies differences that you are not capable of observing on the front end. And that's why we call it unobserved heterogeneity. Historically, when we looked at the concept called moderation, moderation was limited to what we call categorical variables, grouping variables. With partial least squares, you can use continuous variables. What's the value of continuous variables as opposed to categorical variables? The precision and the accuracy of your ability to identify moderation is higher and better. And in traditional techniques, including covariance-based SEM, you cannot use continuous moderators. We have concepts called moderated mediation and mediated moderation. I'm sorry if we've got some undergraduates here who don't understand those concepts, but they're really very important concepts in data analysis. If you can test mediation and moderation, your ability to predict an outcome, like the likelihood of purchase, is often increased by as much as 30 to 50%. So more sophisticated models that you can run with structural equation modeling improve your prediction ability, which improves your use of data, which improves the performance of your organization. Okay, well, let's stop now. I'll do what he wants me to do. Thank you very much again. I hope you're having fun. Any questions? Any questions? Okay, yeah. Can I ask a question? Can I answer them? You're not going to run me out? You sure? Okay.
Okay, thank you, Chef, for giving me a chance. Let me introduce myself. My name is Halim. I am a master's degree student. Okay, I want to ask, is it okay for us to use DLSM where the prior theory is strong? And I want to ask, what do you mean with the philosophy of DLSM in a silver bulb? Thank you.
The second one was about what now?
I mean, what do you mean with the philosophy that TLSM in a silver bulb? Thank you.
Okay, let's talk about the concept of established theory. The answer is yes. You can apply PLS almost anywhere. In fact, though, PLS from the very beginning was promoted as a technique which was useful, as I pointed out, with small samples. What we've begun to do since then is to say, yes, it's okay with small samples, but it's also okay with large samples. And in fact, the benefits of using it with large samples are equally as important and valuable as with small samples, because with big data, we have huge samples. So number one, with large samples, small samples, it's useful. Secondly, with theory, yes, you can use it with established theory. You can use it with exploratory research. Covariance-based SEM is strictly limited to testing and confirming established theory. With partial least squares, you can test and confirm both exploratory research as well as established research. And in fact, I have a forthcoming article that is called Improving, I don't remember specifically, but it's about improving measurement quality using confirmatory composite analysis, or CCA. And confirmatory composite analysis is all about the alternative approach to confirming theories that we've been using forever. The approach that we've been using with covariance-based SIM is called confirmatory factor analysis. The approach that you would use with structural equation modeling, the partial least squares version, is called confirmatory composite analysis. That article, right before, I just finished revising it. I haven't resubmitted it, but it's not going out for review again, according to the editor. So as of, let's say, a couple more months, that process about how you apply partial least squares with confirming established theory is going to be out and available. If you want to see an early copy of it, I'll be glad. You send me an email, and then after the first of the year, you'll be able to cite that as the approach, because we often have been getting questions, just like you asked, a good question about, well, everything I read says it's for exploration, but it's also for confirmation. It's a little bit different than is the traditional confirmatory factor analysis, but the process is essentially as effective. There's also some other things I didn't mention when I was talking about emerging methods. One of the things that we published an article on this last year was the process called PLS Predict. And if you're using partial least squares, the primary objective for using it, in addition to understanding and confirming theory, is in fact prediction. Okay, so PLS prediction, or PLS Predict, is a new method of assessing what we call out-of-sample prediction. R squared, Q squared, F squared, aren't you excited? If people know about regression and they know about these terms, they know what R squared, Q squared, F squared, and other metrics of prediction are. Those are what we call in-sample prediction, which means that you identify and predict the results, like likelihood of purchasing, but it's based only upon the observations that are included in the sample that you're using. So it's in-sample. It predicts an outcome with the same sample that it identifies relationship with. PLS Predict, though, is an out-of-sample prediction, but it doesn't mean that you collect a second sample. It means that you have to collect a larger sample, which to some extent limits the advantage of smaller samples, but PLS Predict starts with what we call an analysis, or some people call it a training sample. It randomly divides your sample into, and the default is 10 subsamples. And it selects a single sample to predict, which is not in the sample that you develop your prediction model with. And it predicts a sample of observations that are not in that. So it randomly divides it the first time into 10 samples. It combines 9, predicts the 10th one. But it doesn't stop with that. It does it again and again. And the default is to do that 10 times. So it randomly divides, predicts a holdout sample the first time, second time, 10 times, and then it averages the prediction of the 10 samples, and that is defined as out-of-sample prediction, and it improves dramatically your ability to say, my prediction capability is in fact 20%, 40%, 60%, or whatever. By the way, the fact that you are assessing out-of-sample prediction also invariably means that it's going to be a little bit smaller than in-sample prediction, because in-sample prediction is optimized for the sample that you're developing your model for. But it's still a much more accurate of the reality, an accurate prediction of the reality of what you can expect to find when you start applying it to the marketplace out there that organizations and data scientists are increasingly doing. Any other questions? Yes. Bob?
Thank you, sir. So I'm Devi, I'm one of the faculty member here, but I'm pretty new to PLSM, so I'm currently learning about it. As you mentioned that one of the advantage of PLSM compared to CPSM is that it requires a relatively small samples, right?
Well, PLS is capable of obtaining a solution with much smaller samples than covariance-based SIM.
Yeah, my question is, but isn't it also depend on the number of the indicators that we have in our models?
Well, the traditional estimate of sample sizes was based upon, originally, when I first started my work, a ratio of 10 to 1, which is the number of variables. And then my co-authors and I, sometime in the late 70s, did some simulation studies, and we assessed the error associated with a 5 to 1 ratio instead of a 10 to 1 ratio, and we found that it didn't make much difference. So in my book, and also some others, since the late 70s, we've been recommending a ratio of the number of variables times 5. That's one way of calculating the sample size. What I would tell you, and I don't think it's in another PowerPoint I have, but let me say, to answer your question simply, and there's probably no simple question, you want to think about the number of variables, but in our baseline model, have you read my book? The PLS primer? You really should, it's good. Anyway, the PLS primer, let's see, has it has 33 variables in the baseline model in the book. Because we've been talking about small sample sizes, I wanted to see just how small a sample you could use to get a sample. Because in all the methods books that I publish, to simplify it, we developed a database which represents a problem, a research problem, which is relevant generally for marketing and management, but for social sciences in general. And every technique and every chapter uses the same data. You get different solutions, but it overcomes the challenges of someone having to learn a new problem every time. So our model in the PLS books is what's called a reputation model, and it looks at the extent to which reputation influences loyalty. And we talked about loyalty a little bit more. So I'm going to give you an answer here, but I just want to give you background. So anyway, that model has 33 variables, and so I didn't start with one observation, because I knew it would. But I started with 2, I got a solution. 3, I got a solution. 4, I got a solution. I was getting solutions, but I mentioned earlier, and it may have gone by you quickly, but I suggested to you that I like to teach my students, and I recommend to you that you're able to identify what we call red flags. Red flags are results in your numbers which you should question because they don't look logical. So having run that model with a sample that we have in the book, which is 344, I knew exactly what the results should be. So for every small sample of 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, I was getting a solution, but it was illogical. There were red flags. But the bottom line is, I got the correct solution with 9 observations. 9 observations. One of the things that helps you to do that is exactly what the method is based upon. It's called partial least squares structural vision modeling. And the way that it develops a solution, in contrast to covariance-based SIM. Covariance-based SIM is called a full information technique, which means that it analyzes the entire model, all the variables, at the same time. Okay, and when it does that, the ratio of 5 to 1 is definitely required. Partially squares, though, partials out various components of the model, and it gets a solution with it divided, and then it puts it together. So it pulls it apart, puts it together. But when it puts it together, it's already obtained a solution for the multiple variables. So, as a specific example, the reason that 9 is required in our model is the largest number of individual variables that you analyze in combination is 8. So you have to have one more observation in addition to the largest number of variables that you have to analyze, because it's partialed out. Partialed out, put together. Partialed out, put together. So to answer your question, you can get solutions with less than a ratio of 5 to 1. You just need to be very careful in terms of what you do and get a little bit more knowledge than probably where you are now. All right? Do I need to quit? Yes. One more question. Okay.
We talk about the covariance space. It is related to the reflective measures, right? And partially squares, we don't care about whether it is reflective or formative. And how this then relate to the conceptual definition? Some definition of a construct require it is reflective. How do you then deal with this kind of conceptual definition using partially square?
Well, one of the values of partially squares is the fact that you are not limited, and I'm sorry for those of you who have not gotten at least the first course in statistics, maybe beyond the first course. But I talked a little bit about measurement, and there's a concept called reflective measurement models and formative measurement models. And those two kinds of measurement are both acceptable, except they have specific assumptions for each kind of measurement. Partially squares is, because of its flexibility, able to handle both reflective and formative. So it really doesn't matter the current level of knowledge that we have about measurement in general. All kinds of measurement are capable of being used with partially squares. Only reflectively measured constructs or measurement models are capable of being used with covariance-based sim. Now, I want to caution you, if you read the literature, the people who are scholars, and I guess I have to consider myself a scholar in covariance-based sim since I've been writing about it since 1980. But anyway, the scholars who still have not accepted partially squares recognize when we started talking about measurement models that are formatively based, and they said, wow, we're going to be left behind if we agree and accept the fact that formative can't be used with covariance-based sim. Well, I'm here to tell you today it can't be used with it, in spite of the fact when you read the literature, you will find that they refer to something called mimic models. All right, multiple indicators that are formatively measured. I'm here to tell you, and I tell this to them all the time, that is what I refer to as voodoo statistics. Do people know what voodoo is? Yeah, I spent 28 years in New Orleans, and there's some voodoo people down in New Orleans. Actually, close to New Orleans at Louisiana State University. You should not be using mimic models to insert formative measures in your covariance-based sim models. What that process is it is a method of fooling the mathematics. Because the mathematics, unless you fool the mathematics, you cannot get a solution with formative measured constructs. Okay, so you should not be using formative measures, strictly speaking, with covariance-based sim.